near Hebron, and from there we walked under the cover of night into a neighboring Palestinian village. After quietly moving through the alleyways and streets, my platoon arrived at a house at the top of a hill. I went with my commander and a small group of soldiers to the front door. It was maybe 2 a.m. My commander knocked at the door, and a middle-aged Palestinian man answered. My commander asked him if he spoke Hebrew, and he said no. He then asked him if he spoke English, and he said that he did. My commander turned to me to relay to the man that we would be taking control of his home to use as a base while we were operating in the town, searching for the missing boys. I told the man to gather his family members into the living room, and he did, without protest, almost like this was a completely normal request, like this was just a regular night. He had done nothing wrong. He was not a suspect in the kidnapping. His house happened to be located in the right place for operation. That's why we were there. My platoon entered his home, our faces painted different shades of green, tracking dirt and dust across the floor as we hauled our heavy packs up to the second-floor bedrooms, where we set up our reconnaissance equipment. Then our routine for the next 2 days unfolded. We took shifts guarding the owner of the house and his family on the first floor, who were not permitted to leave. We went on patrols in search of the nearby neighborhood, used the equipment we set up to monitor the surrounding area, and took breaks to sleep on the floor of the bedrooms we had taken over. The room I slept in was a kid's bedroom and had cartoon characters painted across the child-sized furniture. During those days in the house, the Palestinian man, I never learned his name, would ask me, as an English speaker, how long we would be there. When would we be leaving? He told me he worked at a school and he needed to be there. I didn't know when we'd be leaving. Even if I did, I probably wouldn't have been allowed to say. After a couple of days, we finally packed up and left. As we walked out of the living room to the front door, I remember looking at him and saying, "I'm sorry." We walked to the next Palestinian town and took over another Palestinian home, and then another. After my service, this was the experience I thought about the most, even more than the war in Gaza that I served in just a few short weeks after this. I thought about the Palestinian man and his family and the ease at which we barged in and disrupted their home, the arbitrary nature of why we stayed where we did. He and his family had done nothing wrong. We stayed in his home for the very reason they had done nothing wrong. At the time, I probably viewed him and other Palestinians with suspicion and fear. But after coming back to the States, after my service ended, I began to question that narrative of fear. I was struck by how little the American-Jewish conversation around Israel and Palestine had changed since I was away. But in reality, it was I who had changed. I remember during those years immediately after my service listening to an episode of NPR's Hidden Brain. In that episode, a member of Breaking the Silence spoke about taking over Palestinian homes to use as bases during operations during his time as an IDF soldier. He said this is a maneuver known as a straw widow. I had never heard this term used before. I didn't know soldiers routinely took over Palestinian homes. I thought when we did it, it was an exceptional situation. But how would I know? I had never talked about these experiences before. I had never heard anyone talk about these experiences before. It was only then, listening to a podcast, that I realized that the Palestinian man whose home we stayed in acted like Israeli soldiers taking over his home was the most normal thing in the world because it happens all the time. Those days I spent in the house became a focal point of questioning so many things I had learned about Israel and Palestine. But for the Palestinian family whose house we took over, and for many of his neighbors, it was just a regular week in the West Bank. I reached out to Breaking the Silence a few years later and shared testimony of my time operating in the West Bank and Gaza. If there is a recurring motif in the section of Vayera I'll read this week, it is about hosting guests. One hot day, Abraham rushes to greet 3 travelers who approach his tent, and he insists that he stays with them to wash up, rest, and eat, without knowing they are angels. He and his wife Sarah quickly rush to prepare an elaborate meal for these guests, who after resting and eating tell Abraham and Sarah, who have been struggling to have children, that Sarah will soon have a son, revealing their divine identity only after Abraham and Sarah's instinct to accommodate them so hospitably. The travelers then set out for the city of Sodom, where they run into Abraham's nephew Lot, who was just as eager to host the travelers as Abraham was. Lot insists his guests also wash up, rest, and eat without knowing they are angels, and he too prepares an elaborate feast for them. These angels have not just come to rest, but to warn Lot that he will be destroying the city of Sodom. But they tell Lot to gather his family and escape. The repetition of Abraham and Lot hosting guests, both followed by good news, emphasizes how important the text views hosting guests. Hosting guests, welcoming others into your space, is a sign of a person's righteousness. That making sure the people who pass through your home are nourished and rested is praiseworthy and deserving of reward. I was not a guest for those several days in the Palestinian family's home. I was an occupying force. The host says, "Come to my home, I insist." The soldier says, "I am coming into your home. Do not resist." Home is a sacred space, the location of so many of life's joys, sorrows, memories, life cycle events. The opening up of one's home, an act of vulnerability and trust, is a blessing for the guest and the host. The invasion of one's home, an act of violation and aggression, is traumatic and destructive for the occupied as well as the occupier. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to join Breaking the Silence on a delegation to the West Bank. On this trip, I met with Israeli and Palestinian activists working together to confront and challenge the Israeli army, Jewish settler violence, and other mechanisms of occupation. One hot summer day, I rested and ate a meal in the home of Nasser Nawaja, a Palestinian activist from the South Hebron Hills town of Susia. Susia has been demolished many times by the IDF, as it lies in a part of the West Bank where Israel prohibits